Good day and welcome back to another World of Warcraft video. In this video, I wanted to talk a little bit about some news that's come out recently in the form of the information regarding the combat assistant and single button assistant, and what my thoughts are on that, and basically some of the pros, some of the cons I can foresee, and some of the things I'm interested in finding out. So let's start off with what the news is. So in the latest news in regards to upcoming content, the developers have placed here new UI options that will become available later on. Combat Assistant is a new feature coming to the game that highlights the recommended next ability based on resources and situations your character is in. Features designed to help new players who are trying new specialization, or for those looking for additional guidance on abilities they should use. This new feature is configured as an additional option that's part of the base UI to assist you with damage rotations, no matter which specialization you're using. So there's a couple of things to glean from that, but we'll talk about the single button assistant first. In addition, a single button assistant can be used to cast the next recommended ability in the sequence. This assistant is designed to have a small additional global cooldown added between abilities, so that it is still useful for learning new abilities or new skills, aiding those who are looking for additional help, and for those who want to experience the story or game on a more casual basis. It will also detect when an area of effect or multi-target spell should be used. Both of these new options should aid in lowering the barrier of entry for new players or players looking to explore new characters. As with the cooldown manager, it will continue to evolve over time. So before we talk about the pros and cons, I can see let's talk about some things that they mention here that I think are important for understanding. So firstly, they mention here the new feature is configured as an additional option that is part of the base UI. Both are probably going to be toggleable, and that is always a good sign. So whenever something's not enforced on you, I think that's always good. It does also mention here, basically, that it highlights the next recommended ability based on the resources and situation your character's in, but it mentions there at the bottom of the combat assistant, this new feature is configured as an additional option to assist you with damage rotation. So I think both this and the single button assistant are only going to be for damage rotation abilities. So they're not going to be for GCDs that are off cooldown. They're not going to be for defensive cooldown abilities. They won't be, for things like when you bloodlust. They won't be for utility-based spells. They won't be for things like vengeance. They won't be, basically anything that's outside the offensive rotation. So I think from that aspect, in terms of the combat and single button assistant, you still won't be able to play your class at a high level, in terms of functionality. They also mention with the single button assistant that they are going to add in a additional layer or delay to the global cooldown, so it shouldn't be something you can use at a high level. So let's talk about each one individually, and I want to talk about the pros and cons. So we'll start with the combat assistant. So I think the combat assistant for me is not so bad. I've played Final Fantasy XIV. Final Fantasy XIV has something similar, where it basically lights up the next move in your combos. I mean, WoW already has something similar. So this combat assistant will probably be very similar to that. Where it's like basically going to give you a little bit more of an idea as to what you're going to use. Based on what they mention here about the single button assistant, it does seem like it will detect if you have multiple enemies to target and may offer you an AoE spell, but it will highlight those abilities, it won't use them for you, and I think that's okay. You can always remove it if you don't want it. I think it's fine. I don't really see a con with the combat assistant. I guess, for players who are, how can I say, maybe completely against these type of things, there's a con there from like a game design point of view. But I think without getting too into it, I don't see a negative. Pros is, yes, it is going to help new players a lot. And it's also going to basically give you a base guideline to learning your rotation. I guess the con could be that depending on what it recommends and the player, you can still be led into the wrong decision. But I think ultimately the combat assistant for me is not such a huge deal, pros and cons wise. Let's talk about the single button assistant. This one I think is something that is very, 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 very questionable. Giving players a single button to do their damage rotation is not the end of the world, if it is done absolutely perfectly. The problem is it's not going to be done absolutely perfectly. So the single button assistant either has to be, so in theory it has to be good enough that it can cover for players who want to do the most basic of basic content, so like LFR, group finder dungeons, time walking dungeons, open world events, and it has to essentially account for all of that and allow them to play their rotation to a level that's acceptable for that. But it also has to be bad enough that it is not something that can almost be like becomes then mandatory for players. Because if you do not maintain the skill gap required to play WoW at a high level, you're going to have people lose interest in that high level gameplay, and it's going to become a problem. So the single button assistant, I think, is much more difficult to fine tune. So I think that's one con. I think also it can definitely lead people into playing the game, like poorly. So just never bothering to learn the game, which can create a bigger gap actually between your casual player base and your pro player base, especially if they're not paying attention to the rotation. And I think there's no real pro to it for me. I think the combat assistant is a great idea that can work. I don't see the understanding behind the single button assistant. It just feels like a way to basically provide a very inefficient way to play the game, which already we kind of have. Like if you enter another far, you have a ton of players that are just slamming buttons randomly. Yes, they'll now be slamming one button and it should in theory be doing things better, but I just don't think that's going to work that way. So for me, I'm a little bit disappointed in the single button mechanic. I think it's unnecessary. I think it opens up a lot of questions. Like if you run it and it's optional and it's too good, people are going to be flamed if they don't use it. If you make it really, really bad, people who use it are still going to get nowhere and just are going to get even worse at the game. So there's just a really fine line to run with a single button mechanic that I think is just not necessary. But let me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear your guys' opinions. And good day and welcome back to another World of Warcraft video.